World War II was the first total war, blurring the line between combatant and civilian. It represented the moral collapse of the West, industrializing barbarism on an unprecedented scale. Its impact echoes in the ashes of cities like Dresden. What lessons do you think humanity has yet to learn from this conflict? Like this post and leave us your opinion in the comments. Understanding this conflict requires exploring the complex interactions between the nation's internal politics. Their radical ideologies, Nazism, fascism, and Japanese militarism, the technological advances that made it so deadly, and the systematic and planned brutality against entire populations. The war was not confined to the battlefields. It encompassed the rear guard, the factories, where the mass production of armaments was crucial, marking the industrial supremacy of the Allies, espionage and the complexities of information warfare, the omnipresent propaganda that dehumanized the enemy, and tragically the extermination camps, veritable death factories designed with industrial efficiency. It is essential to recognize that the conflict was driven by the deliberate and explicit will of the Axis regimes to destroy the liberal world order and restructure it based on racial principles. Imperial domination and the absolute denial of basic human rights, not a mere territorial dispute. The Treaty of Versailles, signed in 1919, ironically intended to ensure lasting peace after World War I. It unwittingly sowed the seeds of future conflict. The peace was not conciliatory but punitive. The harsh reparations imposed on Germany, calculated in billions of gold marks, the loss of significant territories such as the coal-rich Saar region, the demilitarization of the Rhineland and the Eastern territories, including the Polish corridor that divided East Prussia from the rest of the Reich, and the humiliating War Guilt Clause, Article 231, generated a deep nationalist resentment and a sense of injustice and betrayal in large sectors of the German population. A sentiment skillfully and cynically manipulated by far-right forces. This breeding ground of economic and political humiliation, exacerbated by the catastrophic hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic in the early 1920s and the subsequent Great Depression of 1929, was masterfully exploited by the rise of Adolf Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party, Nazi Party. Hitler, a charismatic demagogue and a pioneering master of modern propaganda, with key figures such as Joseph Goebbels, promised not only to restore German greatness and break the chains of Versailles, but also to unite all German-speaking peoples into a single, powerful nation, a Reich of 1,000 years appealing to myths of racial purity. His ideology, embodied in My Struggle, was a virulent mosaic of radical anti-Semitism, virulent anti-communism, and unlimited military expansionism. For Hitler, war was not only inevitable, but a necessary purification to achieve the habitat or living space in Eastern Europe, which implied the total subjugation, forced relocation, and eventual annihilation or enslavement of the Slavic populations, Poles, Russians, Ukrainians, whom he considered racially inferior, subhumans. German rearmament, often carried out in secret and in direct violation of Versailles, such as the reintroduction of compulsory military service, was the first concrete step towards conflict. Simultaneously, in Italy, Benito Mussolini had established the world's first fascist state in 1922, consolidating his power with the title of lead. Italian fascism promoted an aggressive nationalism nostalgic for the Roman Empire, an unquestioning cult of personality surrounding the leader, and a relentless imperial expansion in the Mediterranean and Africa, seeking to transform the Mediterranean into our sea. The invasion of Ethiopia, Abyssinia, in 1935, in clear violation of the principles of the ineffective League of Nations, and the documented use of chemical weapons in that campaign, mustard gas, served as a brutal rehearsal for fascist aggression and exposed to the world the moral and operational weakness of the democratic powers that refused to take decisive action. Applying only symbolic sanctions, the Rome-Berlin Axis, formalized in 1936, solidified the alliance between these two revisionist powers with imperial aspirations, which Japan joined with the Anti-Comintern Pact against international communism, laying the foundations for the Tripartite Pact of 1940. In the Pacific, Japan, under the growing control of an ultra-nationalist military clique and heavily influenced by state Shintoism, which had progressively marginalized civilian power and even the emperor, although he remained the divine figure of the state, also pursued radical expansionism. This expansionism was driven by the critical need for natural resources, oil, rubber, minerals, iron, for its growing industrial base and the deeply ingrained belief in its racial superiority and imperial destiny, Hakko Ichiu, the 8 corners of the world under one roof. the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, establishing the puppet state of Manchukuo, and the large-scale war against China beginning in 1937. Known as the Second Sino-Japanese War, demonstrated Tokyo's ambition to create a greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. It is crucial to highlight the war crimes committed by the Imperial Japanese Army in China, such as the atrocious Nanjing massacre where tens of thousands of civilians died, and the use of biological warfare by the sinister Unit 731. They anticipated the systematic brutality and dehumanization that would characterize total war in the Pacific. The initial response of Western democracies, primarily Great Britain, France, and the United States, although the latter remained largely isolationist until Pearl Harbor, was to appeasement. The devastating trauma of World War I, the awareness of the enormous losses and the Great Depression, which had exhausted economic resources, made its leaders deeply reluctant to contemplate another military confrontation. The strategy, led by British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, was based on the fatally erroneous belief that Hitler's demands were limited and that by satisfying some of them, primarily the revision of the unfair Treaty of Versailles, lasting peace would be ensured. This policy, while understandable given the context, was in retrospect a moral and strategic miscalculation that only served to embolden the dictator. This appeasement reached its climax and most infamous point in the Munich Conference of 1938. There, Great Britain and France yielded to Hitler's demand to annex the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, a strategic area rich in defensive fortifications and industrial resources based on the argument of German self-determination. Czechoslovakia, the only functioning democracy in Central Europe, was not invited to its own partition, symbolizing the abandonment of an allied nation in the face of blackmail. Chamberlain returned to London proclaiming that he had secured peace for our time, a claim that history would disprove in less than a year. Far from being deterred, Hitler felt emboldened by Western weakness. In March 1939, he broke his promises and occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, Bohemia and Moravia, establishing a protectorate and making it clear that his goal was not self-determination for the Germans, but total conquest and contempt for international agreements. It was this act of blatant breach of faith that finally convinced Great Britain and France of Hitler's belligerent and boundless intentions and led them to guarantee Poland's independence. The final step towards war was taken with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939, a surprising non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin. Ideologically opposed, fascism versus communism, pragmatic convenience and strategic calculation prevailed. This agreement, which included a devastating secret protocol to divide Poland and other spheres of influence in Eastern Europe, including the Baltic states, freed Hitler from the immediate threat of a two-front war and gave him the green light for his invasion plan. For Stalin, it meant gaining precious time to rearm after the massive purges in the Red Army and, crucially, to recover territories lost in the First World War. The war began at 4:45 in the morning of 1 September 1939 with the German invasion of Poland, carried out through the new and devastating doctrine of the Blitzkrieg, or Blitzkrieg. This strategy, a radical contrast to the static trench warfare of the First World War, combined the speed of tank divisions, panzer, motorized infantry and close air support, stucco, rapidly breaking through enemy defenses at key points and surrounding static forces. 2 days later, Great Britain and France, belatedly honoring their guarantees to Poland, declared war on Germany. However, effective aid to Poland was scarce, and the country was quickly defeated and divided between Germany and the Soviet Union, which invaded from the east on 17 September, fulfilling the secret clauses of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. After the fall of Poland, a period of 8 months known as the Joker War, Phony War, or Sit War ensued on the Western Front, where French and British forces waited behind the immense but static Maginot Line, while Hitler prepared his next move. This quiet ended abruptly in April 1940, when Germany invaded Denmark and Norway to secure the vital supply of Swedish iron ore, crucial to the German war machine, and establish crucial naval bases for combat in the Atlantic. The decisive blow came in May 1940 with the invasion of France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. In a bold and unprecedented move, the Panzer Germans, led by generals such as Guderian and Rommel, bypassed the heavily defended Maginot Line and attacked through the supposedly impenetrable wooded hills of the Ardennes, a move unexpected by the French High Command, which was still thinking in terms of trench warfare. The Allied forces were quickly outflanked, and the British Expeditionary Force found itself trapped against the sea at Dunkirk. Operation Dynamo resulted in a miraculous evacuation of more than 338,000 British and French soldiers. Carried out by an improvised flotilla of military and civilian vessels, a triumph of the British will, but leaving all their heavy equipment behind. France fell on 22 June 1940, humiliated and divided into a German occupation zone and the collaborationist puppet state of Vichy France. This disaster left Great Britain alone, under the new leadership of Winston Churchill, a man whose unflappable eloquence and iron will would become the ultimate symbol of democratic resistance, the Battle of Britain. Fought mainly in the air during the summer and autumn of 1940, was the first major strategic defeat for Nazi Germany and the first setback for the Blitzkrieg. The Air Force attempted to destroy the Royal Air Force to gain air superiority, an essential prerequisite for Operation Sea Lion, the amphibious invasion of Great Britain. However, it was repelled by the tenacious British defense, assisted by the radar network, Chain Home, which provided crucial early warning, and the efficient fighters, the Spitfire and the Hurricane. Despite the Blitz, sustained bombing of cities such as London, Coventry and Liverpool, a strategic act of terror intended to break civilian morale. Hitler was forced to postpone the invasion indefinitely, a crucial turn of events that prevented the Allied collapse in Western Europe and kept Britain's hopes alive. Simultaneously, the conflict spread to the Mediterranean and North Africa. Italy, under Mussolini, unsuccessfully attempted to invade Greece and Egypt, demonstrating the inherent weakness of its forces and its lack of logistical preparedness, forcing Hitler to divert precious resources to rescue his struggling ally. The shipment of the Africa Corps under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, turned the Desert Campaign into a war of maneuver, logistics and attrition. However, these campaigns, along with the need to invade Yugoslavia and Greece in April of 1941 to secure the flank and support Italy, Operation Marita, diverted vital forces and crucially delayed by weeks Hitler's main and fateful ambition, the invasion of the Soviet Union. Like, subscribe and share. On 22 June 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union, breaking the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and opening the largest, most brutal and bloodiest front of the entire war, where 80% of German ground combat took place and the majority of casualties occurred. The objective was not only military but also ideological and genocidal: the total destruction of Bolshevik communism, the elimination of the Jewish people, and the attainment of habitat for German colonization at the expense of the Slavic population. The initial offensive was devastating, capturing vast territories including Ukraine and Belarus and making millions of Soviet prisoners, most of whom would die of starvation or deliberate mistreatment in what was a relentless war of racial extermination. However, the strategy of the Blitzkrieg failed to achieve the total collapse of the Red Army before the Russian winter. The Soviet scorched earth strategy, the fierce resistance, the immense size of the country which stretched German supply lines to the limit, and the arrival of the freezing winter, the general winter, halted the German forces at the gates of Leningrad, under siege for 900 days, Moscow and Stalingrad at the end of 1941. Stalin was able to mobilize the vast human reserves and industrial resources of the Soviet Union, moving entire factories, piece by piece, east of the Urals, out of German reach while maintaining a constant flow of T-34 tanks and cannons, while benefiting from the vital material support of the Lend-Lease from the United States. While the Wehrmacht forces froze before Moscow in the Pacific, tensions between Japan and the United States over Japanese expansion in Southeast Asia, which threatened the American Philippines and resource-rich European colonies, and the total embargo on American oil, a vital punitive measure that strangled the Japanese war economy, reached a breaking point. On 7 December 1941, Japan launched a devastating surprise attack against the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, mistakenly believing it would cripple the United States long enough for Japan to consolidate a vast empire. This act, far from achieving its long-term goal, unified a previously isolationist nation under the slogan, "Remember Pearl Harbor." The United States declared war on Japan on 8 December. 3 days later, Germany, honoring its alliance with Tokyo, in what many historians consider its biggest strategic mistake since it was not obligated to do so, declared war on Washington. This event transformed the European conflict into a truly global war, sealing the participation of the superpowers in both theaters and, crucially, putting the immense industrial and economic muscle of the United States, the arsenal of democracy, at the service of the Allied cause. A production capacity that the Axis could never match. the year 1942 marked the strategic turning point on both main fronts, where the tide of the war was permanently reversed in favor of the Allies. The initial supremacy of the Axis had ended. In June 1942, the Battle of Midway was a decisive victory for the US Navy. Through the interception and decoding of Japanese communications, thanks to ultra-intelligence, specifically the breaking of the JN-25B code, the US Navy laid an ambush, destroying 4 Japanese heavy aircraft carriers, the heart of their naval strike force. This loss, irreplaceable by Japan's limited industrial capacity, permanently crippled Japan's naval offensive capability and marked the beginning of the Allied strategy of island hopping, focused on reaching Japanese territory. In Europe, the Battle of Stalingrad, from August 1942 to February 1943, was the most brutal and significant turning point, considered the final nail in the coffin of German aspirations in the East. The urban house-to-house fighting took a toll of millions of lives on both sides, but finally Operation Uranus, a massive Soviet counterattack, completely surrounded the German Sixth Army. The surrender of more than 91,000 German soldiers in Stalingrad was a moral and strategic disaster from which the Wehrmacht never recovered. The Red Army took the strategic initiative and began its inexorable, albeit costly, advance westward. Simultaneously in North Africa, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery halted Rommel's final advance towards the Suez Canal at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, ensuring access to Middle Eastern oil. Shortly afterwards, US and British forces landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch. The Axis forces in North Africa, caught in a pincer movement, were crushed in May 1943, clearing the way for the Allied invasion of Italy, the soft belly of Europe that Churchill had championed. Starting from 1943, the Axis was in retreat on all fronts. The Casablanca Conference between Roosevelt and Churchill in January 1943 agreed to the policy of unconditional surrender of the Axis, seeking to avoid any ambiguity that could revive German conspiracy theories, such as the stab in the back after World War I. The Allied invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, and southern Italy in July 1943 led to the overthrow of Benito Mussolini by the Fascist Grand Council and King Victor Emmanuel III. Italy signed an armistice with the Allies in September, but was immediately occupied by Germany, Operation Axis, which disarmed Italian troops and rescued Mussolini as a puppet leader of the Italian Social Republic in the north. The Italian campaign became a slow and brutal, mountainous and difficult battlefront that drained German resources with devastating battles such as Monte Cassino. While the Western Allies were slowly making their way through Italy, the Soviet Union continued its massive offensives on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, ended with a decisive Soviet victory and brought an end to the Wehrmacht's ability to launch large-scale strategic offensives in the East. From then on, the Red Army, better supplied thanks to the American Lend-Lease and with a seemingly inexhaustible troop mobilization capacity, it became the dominant force, pushing the Germans westward with a brutality that mirrored the ferocity of the Nazi occupation. The opening of the Second Front in Western Europe was a primary objective of Allied diplomacy, insistently demanded by Stalin since 1942 to relieve pressure on his front. Finally, on 6 June 1944 D-Day, the Western Allied forces, under the supreme command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, launched Operation Overlord, a massive amphibious and airborne assault on the beaches of Normandy. Despite fierce German defenses, the Atlantic Wall, and the massacre at Omaha Beach, the Allies managed to establish a beachhead. After intense fighting in the Norman Bocage, dense hedges, and the crucial Battle of Falaise, where thousands of German soldiers were trapped, the Allied forces advanced rapidly. Paris was liberated in August 1944. The success of Overlord meant that Germany now faced war on 3 fronts, a strategically unsustainable situation. On the Western Front, the last major German counterattack was the desperate Ardennes offensive, Battle of the Bulge, in December 1944, an attempt by Hitler to split the Allied lines and negotiate a peace. The offensive failed in the face of tenacious resistance, exhausting the last reserves of men and fuel of the Wehrmacht. The end of the war in Europe accelerated in the spring of 1945. The Western Allies crossed the Rhine River and advanced eastward, while the Red Army stormed Berlin. Hitler committed suicide in his bunker, Führerbunker, on 30 April 1945. His successor, Admiral Karl Donitz, authorized the unconditional surrender of all German forces on 7 May 1945, marking VE Day. The war continued in the Pacific, where Japan steadfastly refused to surrender despite continuous defeats, the destruction of its naval capacity, and devastating firebombing of its cities, such as the one on Tokyo in March 1945. Japanese military culture promoted fighting to the last man, Bushido, evident in the brutal and costly battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa in 1945, where the Banzai tactics and the kamikaze attacks caused a high number of Allied casualties. The casualties foreshadowed a catastrophic human cost for a direct invasion of Japan's main islands, Operation Downfall, estimated at millions. The new US President, Harry S. Truman, faced with the prospect of a prolonged war. The imminent Soviet invasion of the Far East and the desire to end the war decisively to save American lives and hasten the end before full Soviet involvement authorized the use of a newly developed weapon in the secret Manhattan Project, the atomic bomb. On 6 August 1945, the bomber Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb, Little Boy, on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Fat Man fell on Nagasaki. Between the two attacks, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria, Operation August Storm. The combination of atomic devastation, a demonstration of power that overcame any defense, and the Soviet entry into the conflict finally convinced Emperor Hirohito to intervene directly in the surrender process. An unprecedented act in modern Japanese history. Japan announced its surrender on 15 August 1945, and the formal signing took place aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on 2 September 1945, officially ending World War II. World War II had an incalculable human cost, estimated between 50 and 85 million dead, most of them civilians. The Soviet Union suffered the greatest losses, estimated at 27 million military and civilians. The war was a crucible of mass atrocities, but it also exposed evil in its most systematic and industrialized form, the Holocaust, Shoah. The Nazi plan for racial annihilation, final solution, designed and methodically executed by the SS, resulted in the murder of approximately 6 million Jews, along with millions of other victims considered undesirable, gypsies, homosexuals, disabled people, and political opponents, in concentration and extermination camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor. The magnitude of this atrocity, along with Japanese crimes in Asia, led to the creation of international tribunals such as the Nuremberg trials for Nazi leaders and the Tokyo trials for Japanese leaders, which tried top Nazi leaders for war crimes, crimes against peace, and the newly defined concept of crimes against humanity. These trials laid the foundation for modern international criminal law, establishing the principle that leaders can be held individually responsible for atrocities committed, even in times of war. The war permanently transformed the world order. The power and wealth of the old European imperial powers, Great Britain and France, was destroyed by war and debt, driving an irreversible process of decolonization in Africa and Asia over the following decades. In addition, two new superpowers emerged, diametrically opposed in ideology and military capability, including the possession for the first time of atomic weapons: the United States, capitalism, liberal democracy, and the Soviet Union, communism, totalitarianism. This bipolarity gave way to the Cold War, a conflict of ideological, geopolitical, and military procurement tension that would dominate the second half of the 20th century. Europe was divided by the Iron Curtain, a metaphor coined by Churchill. Germany, the epicenter of the conflict, was divided into the Federal Republic of Germany, West, capitalist NATO ally, and the German Democratic Republic, East, communist, Warsaw Pact ally. The Cold War was characterized by the nuclear arms race, the creation of antagonistic military alliances, NATO and Warsaw Pact, and proxy wars in places like Korea and Vietnam, keeping the world in a state of armed peace. In an attempt to prevent future catastrophes and foster international cooperation, the United Nations organization was created in 1945, replacing the failed League of Nations. It was designed to provide a platform for global diplomacy, collective security, and the promotion of human rights, establishing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. At the same time, economic institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, created at Bretton Woods in 1944, were designed to regulate and stabilize the global economy, prevent the protectionist practices of the Great Depression, and boost the reconstruction of devastated nations. World War II was, in essence, an epic battle for the survival of humanity and the values of freedom and dignity against the barbarity of totalitarianism. The defeat of the fascist and Nazi dictators was a monumental victory. But it also left a world deeply scarred by trauma and forced to learn to live with the permanent shadow of nuclear annihilation. The legacy of war is a perennial warning about the dangers of extremism. Unbridled nationalism, imperial ambition, and the failure of international vigilance, reminding us that peace is a fragile construct that demands constant effort, democratic vigilance, and a collective commitment to historical memory to prevent history from repeating itself. Like, subscribe, and share. See you next time.